Awesome. I'm going to go ahead and get started. So my name is Nara Kasbergen. I'm here from Washington, D.C., but I was actually born in Gouda, and I grew up in Alphen aan den Rijn. Some of you may have heard of those. And my presentation is called Empathy as a Service, Supporting Mental Health in the Tech Workplace. So I'm going to save most of my self-introduction for the second part of my talk. I'm going to start with a section that I call numbers and nomenclature, which are basically statistics, definitions, and ways to kind of all get us on the same page about what we're talking about here. Then I'll talk more about myself and why I speak up about this. Then the bulk of my talk is going to be about what we can do. And I'm really trying to focus on pragmatic, common sense, action-oriented things that any one of us can do, can put into work in our daily life, in our workplaces. And then finally, I have a very short section called What Must We Do Together that's focused more on the much more difficult, aspirational, kind of thorny issues where all of us have to do our part. So starting off with the numbers and nomenclature. Just as a side note, I usually use US statistics, but given that we're here in the Netherlands, I just updated it to use Dutch statistics. But for the most part, they tend to be about the same. Most Western countries, I think all of these numbers tend to be pretty similar. So even if you're not from Holland, chances are in your country, the numbers are going to be pretty similar. So if you're going to walk away with any statistic from this talk, at the end of the day, I think the one I want you all just to be thinking about is that 1 in 5 adults will experience mental illness in their lifetime. And I tried to put that into perspective and compare it with other kinds of chronic illnesses that are likely to affect you for the rest of your life. So one I looked up was diabetes. That affects 1 in 14 people. Another one was asthma. That affects 1 in 10. And even arthritis, which people are saying is probably one of the biggest health crises, particularly because of our aging population, that still only affects 1 in 14 in Holland. So really, mental illness is one of the most prevalent chronic health conditions, but we really don't talk about it. And just to be clear, when I say mental illness, I'm talking about any and all of these on this list. A lot of them you've probably heard of. Some of them you might have not heard of before. There's a few on this list that people think are probably really common that are less common than they actually are. The two that I really wanted to call out especially here, one is autism spectrum disorders. These are, by most psychologists, included under mental disorders with all of the rest of these. But at the same time, they're kind of different as well. The cause is believed to be different. They're usually there from birth or childhood onwards, whereas a lot of these others you can develop at any particular point in your life. And the treatments and interventions tend to be very different. So organizations that focus on awareness and advocacy tend to focus either on autism spectrum disorders or most of the rest of these. And it just so happens that the organization that I work with tends to focus more on like depression and anxiety and more of the other mental illnesses. So I'm not going to be talking a lot specifically about autism spectrum disorders today, although certainly there's still parts of this talk that are relevant to autism as well. And the other one that I wanted to call out is burnout. Burnout is interesting. In the Netherlands, I think it's been pretty widely accepted for a long time. In the US, it's been much more controversial since the idea was introduced in the 1970s. A lot of people said, there's no way that this is a legitimate illness. Like, you can't get sick from working too much. That's crazy. So luckily, we've come a long way since then. Most psychologists agree that burnout is legitimate, but what they have also found is that actually burnout is probably depression. They did a lot of studies and found that actually the symptoms are almost identical. The only difference is that burnout has usually a pretty specific cause, which is stress from working too much. So we don't need to go back and revise everything that's ever been said and written about burnout and now call it depression. I think it's fine to continue to call it burnout just because of the specific cause, but that's just kind of an interesting FYI. And so a big problem with mental illness is that people tend to have kind of wrong perceptions about what this really means. I think when you say to a lot of people mental illness, they might think of, for example, schizophrenia. But depression is by far the most common mental illness, and it's at least 10 times more prevalent than schizophrenia in the Netherlands and most of the Western countries. Another big problem with depression in particular is that we tend to hone in on specific symptoms. So when you say depression, people usually think, oh, sadness, maybe loss of interest and pleasure in normal activities, or tiredness and lack of energy. But it turns out that there's actually a whole spectrum of emotions and symptoms that go along with depression. So it can also manifest itself in the form of angry outbursts and irritability, sometimes sleeping too much for some people, changes in appetite, also anxiety, agitation, and restlessness. But again, we tend to really hone in on the sadness. And in the West, a big problem is that we tend to make people feel guilty for feeling that way. A very common thing that people tend to say is like, I can't believe that you're feeling sad when kids in Africa are starving. Like, you have so much privilege in your life, how dare you be sad? And a great response that does the rounds on the internet every couple of months that I think is really powerful is telling someone not to be sad because others have it worse is like telling people they can't be happy because others have it better. And to also kind of illustrate how stigmatized mental illness is, I wanted to share a couple of panels from a webcomic from the website Robot Hugs. It's called Helpful Advice, and the subtitle is If Physical Illness Were Treated Like Mental Illness. I don't know how well you all can read, so I'll read the captions. On the left it says, I get that you have food poisoning and all, but you have to at least make an effort. And you just need to change your frame of mind, then you'll feel better. Have you tried, not having the flu? And I don't think it's healthy that you have to take medication every day just to feel normal. Don't you worry that it's changing you from who you really are? It's like you're not even trying. And while lying in bed obviously isn't helping you, you need to try something else. And all of this stigma is dangerous and harmful because 1 in 3 individuals with mental illness do not seek professional help. There's some interesting demographic differences. Women are 1.5 times more likely to seek treatment for mental illness compared to men. You'll sometimes find statistics that say that women are also more likely to experience depression and mental illness than men. But I would caution reading too much into those. They're starting to think that those might be inaccurate. For depression in particular, I think a big issue that recent studies are showing is that women are more likely to experience the symptoms of sadness and loss of energy, and lack of interest in normal activities, whereas men are much more likely to experience the symptoms of angry outbursts, irritability, agitation, restlessness, those kinds of things. So men are less likely to realize that they're depressed and also less likely to seek help. But in general, of course, failure to seek help is dangerous. I had some trouble finding statistics. It turns out in the Netherlands, they don't really keep a lot of statistics on suicides, but they think that about 70% of suicides here are likely attributable to depression. And in general, it's globally a big problem as well. The World Health Organization did a study a few years ago, and they released a report where they ranked depressive disorders worldwide number 3 on the list of the global burden of disease. So that's pretty high. And of course, the economic costs are very high as well. In the Netherlands, 23% of hospitalization expenditures are spent on mental and behavioral health care, which is good and bad. It's good that they're treating it, but at the same time, that's still a lot of money that's being spent, which may have, may be reduced if there were earlier interventions, because this is hospitalization expenditures. And in the workplace, 14% of Dutch employees have reported experiencing symptoms of burnout. That's a big chunk of the population. And the estimated annual cost of absenteeism from work and lost productivity due to mental illness is 11.5 billion euros. And to break it down for individual companies, they found that just for one company with about 100 employees, reducing workplace absenteeism by just 1% would increase their revenue by 40,000 euros per year, which is pretty significant. And so on the basis of all of that, you would think, maybe people should speak up. But the reasons why they don't are fear of dismissal, fear of being taken out of promotion consideration, fear of being taken off high-value projects, fear of reduced hours for hourly workers, fear of being asked to take unpaid medical leave, and fear in general of being treated differently. And another big problem in the West in particular is that we also have this saying, or this idea kind of like, leave your personal life at home when you come to work. But when you're living with mental illness, that doesn't work. You can't just turn it off for 8 hours when you go to the office and then turn it back on when you get home and just deal with it then. This is going to be a part of your life every single day. And so we need to be much more accommodating. So switching gears. So why do I speak up about this? I legitimately get asked this question a lot when I pitch this talk to conferences. People are like, well, you're not a mental health care professional, which is true. I'm a software engineer, and I actually went to art school twice. I've only taken 1 psychology class in my entire life, so most of what I know about this is self-taught and researched. I also identify as mentally healthy, and that makes me a little bit of an outlier. Some of you might know some people on the tech conference speaking circuit who talk about this topic, and they're known for speaking out about it because they themselves are living with mental illness. So that's not the case for me. But the reason why I speak up about this is because of her. This is my best friend, Nee. She and I met each other about 7 years ago when we were both living in New York City. She had just moved there from Seattle to start a web development fellowship. She had studied biochem in college, and her parents really wanted her to go to medical school, but she was interested in art and design, and she got this fellowship to teach herself the tools of the trade on the job. So we hit it off immediately. We became almost inseparable. But after about 1.5 years, she realized that the best way to kind of further her career as a developer was to move to San Francisco and start working at a startup there. She'd been doing that for a number of years, and she and I had, of course, kept in close touch, talked almost every day, thanks to the internet. But another thing about Nee is that she had been living for most of her adult life with bipolar disorder, which was a particular challenge in Silicon Valley because of issues like imposter syndrome and her background not coming from kind of a traditional CS education. But we thought she was doing better. She was successful at work. She had made it to senior JavaScript engineer in the company where she was working, and so we thought she was on the right track, and it's really caught us all by surprise when she took her own life last September 14th. So obviously this is still really difficult for me to talk about. I did my best, and I wrote a really long blog post last December that's on Medium if you really want to know more about this. But part of the reason why September 14th as a date is also very significant for me was because on September 16th, I was scheduled to speak at a tech conference near Washington, D.C. called Nation.js. And I was supposed to give a 25-minute talk on Angular. And so as soon as I got the news on September 14th, I realized that was clearly not going to happen. Technology, honestly, was like the last thing that I was thinking about at that point. But at the same time, I realized I'm supposed to be speaking at a JavaScript conference, and my friend was a senior JavaScript engineer. So I kind of just want to say something. I feel like I should take advantage of this opportunity. And so I got in touch with the conference organizers, and I said, hey, is it okay if instead of my 25-minute talk about Angular, I just give a 10-minute lightning talk about mental health in tech? And they agreed. They were very kind. And so basically the day before the conference, I set out to research something about a topic that at the time I knew almost nothing about. And so as I was researching, I found out about this organization called Open Sourcing Mental Illness, started by this guy on the right, Ed Finkler, Funkentron on Twitter. Ed himself had been part of the PHP conference speaker circuit for a number of years. A lot of you probably know him. And a few years ago, he decided to start speaking up about his experiences living with generalized anxiety disorder and ADHD, and how that impacted his life as a developer. And his talk really resonated with a lot of people, and so he formed this organization called Open Sourcing Mental Illness around that whole idea of advocacy and awareness, making people realize that this is an issue and we should do something about it in tech. And one thing that Open Sourcing Mental Illness does every year is a survey called the Mental Health in Tech Survey, where they send it out to different people working in tech, and they ask them questions to kind of gauge how mental health is treated in their company, and particularly often comparing it to physical health as well, to try to understand what that gap is, how stigmatized the topic is, and how much more work we have to do. And so I included some of that research in my lightning talk at Nation.js. And one thing that I showed in the presentation that immediately resonated with people, like they just got it instantaneously, were these two graphs. There were two questions. Do you think that discussing a physical health issue with your employer would have negative consequences? And do you think that discussing a mental health issue with your employer would have negative consequences? And so on the left, you can see for the physical health issue, the no's make up almost 3/4 of the pie. But on the right, for the mental health issue, the yeses and the maybes make up almost 2/3. So this demonstrates pretty clearly that there's a stigma in the workplace and that we need to do something about it. So I got a lot of great reactions to my talk at Nation.js. A lot of people thanked me and said, it's great that you're speaking up about this. Ed got in touch with me and asked me to join the OSMI Slack and stay and figure out if I wanted to be involved in the organization. And I said yes, and so I'm still there as a volunteer today. And I think my biggest role in that community has just been to, as someone who identifies as mentally healthy, has been to listen to people like Ed, to people like Gary, when they talk about their experiences, and try to figure out what people like myself can do. And some days I have to admit that it's not easy. There's a lot of stuff that I take for granted. It's not always easy for me to put myself in, for example, Ed's shoes. But something that he said in one of his talks that I attended at a conference in November really stuck with me, which is I could do so many awesome things if only my own head didn't get in the way. And this was really striking to me because I realized as a developer, my ability to do my job rests solely in my head. I use it 8 hours a day. I don't have to have muscles to be a web developer. And so I just completely take for granted that my head always does what I want it to do. But it's not the same way for people like Ed. And so that really started me on the path of thinking about, what can people like myself do to help? So that brings us to the next section. And kind of as background for this, I started thinking about if we're thinking about tech workplaces specifically, what are some of the key characteristics? So one is, for example, the work is challenging and stressful. Our jobs are highly collaborative. Many of us have relocated for a job. Most of us work remotely at least part of the time. We're often expected to be available outside of work hours. Someone needs to fix things when they break, even if that happens overnight. And there is a heavy emphasis on drinking culture. And so I was looking at this list and I decided to start thinking about relocation in particular, because it turns out that at Nee's funeral, a couple of her friends mentioned that one of the only warning signs that they had had before she took her own life was that she had mentioned to a couple of people that she regretted not moving back to Seattle. And so I was thinking about that a lot, and I didn't want to say, relocation is going to be bad 100% of the time. There have to be good reasons why people do it. So I decided to just start breaking it down into positives and negatives. And so on the positive side, I thought, it's much easier to feel like you're a part of the team and helping toward the mission if you are on site with everyone else. In Nee's case, it can also bring you closer to a community of practitioners in your field compared to where you currently are. That's why she wanted to go to San Francisco. But on the negative side, it takes someone away from the existing support structures that they have already built up. Their family, their friends, their therapist, etc. Also, moving is generally also always going to be stressful. And making new friends as an adult is surprisingly hard. So looking at this list, I was just thinking about, what can we do? And the first solution that I thought of is a little bit more aspirational, but I believe very strongly in this one, so I wanted to put it here up front, which is that as a community, I think we need to stop saying that the best way to succeed in tech is to relocate to Silicon Valley. That might have been true 10 or 15 years ago, but I think we've come a long way since then. The ability to work remotely has improved vastly, and so we need to become more accepting of alternative choices. Focusing more on pragmatic solutions. If you're a manager, take another look at your hiring practices and see whether remote employment is an option. And if it turns out that it's not, if you feel very strongly that everyone has to be co-located in one office, create what I'm calling the welcome wagon for new colleagues who have had to relocate to join your company. This is something that we're going to be trying out at my company this summer, actually, because we're relocating our Boston office to join us in DC. So the first step is, ideally on the very first day, take the new employee out for lunch or dinner with the team, and avoid alcohol at that first social event. And I'll talk more about alcohol in a little while. But after that, the focus really needs to be on trying to help that new person integrate themselves into the community outside of just work. And one really easy way to do that is every team member just identify one thing that they can do with this person outside of work hours. So for example, if you have a monthly book club that you're a part of, maybe invite them to join you for one of your meetings. If you like to go rock climbing or hiking on the weekends, if you're an outdoors person, invite them to join you and see if they're into that. If you're part of some kind of sports league, like in DC, bocce leagues are really popular. It's just a fun way for people to get together after work. Invite them to join you and see if they're into that. If you like to go volunteering, if you work at a homeless shelter or a soup kitchen, or you work with at-risk youth, invite them to come with you. For all of these, the goal is just to get them outside of the workplace, introduce them to activities that they can do on the weekends, and help them meet like-minded adults so they can start making friends and building back up those support structures. So moving on to remote work, as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think remote work in general is pretty positive in tech. It's led to, I think, a lot of improvements in the way that we work and we live. And for mental health in particular, it often means flexible hours, and that makes it a lot easier to attend daytime therapy appointments. Because it turns out that therapists actually like to work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So if you want to start seeing a therapist, you're going to have to do that during your workday. And if you're in the office, that means you need to get up in front of all of your coworkers, and everyone basically knows that you're heading out somewhere other than work, which is awkward. It can also make it easier to stick to medication regimens if you are at home. It can make it easier to take breaks, and it's usually quiet and more peaceful than the office, unless you have like a newborn. But it's generally more quiet. But on the negative side, there's a sense of isolation, and this one is interesting because I've had a couple of friends who recently started working remotely full time. And for all of them, like the first 2 or 3 months, they're like, this is amazing, this is awesome, why have I not done this my entire life? This is the best thing ever. And then after that honeymoon period kind of wears off, they're like, this kind of sucks, I feel pretty lonely, I miss talking to people. And this kind of sense of isolation and loneliness sets in. It can also make it harder to build strong relationships with your coworkers, especially if you're the only one who's remote and everyone else is co-located. And even if you're not, living with mental illness yourself, but you just want to support your colleagues, it can make it harder to tell if everyone's doing okay. If the only ways that you can kind of interact are, through Slack or the occasional video call. And it can make it more challenging to maintain a work-life balance, especially if your home is now your office. That can make it harder to say, it's 5 o'clock, I'm going to shut off my work email, I'm not going to do any more work, I'm just going to focus on my personal time now. So some of the solutions, I think the biggest one is to look into co-working spaces. They've been very successful, and I think everyone who I've heard has tried it out has really liked it. And I think the best way to make that idea catch on is for the company to make some funds available, because there's usually a membership fee. So if your company is willing to say, at least for the first month we'll pay, I think a lot of people will be more likely to try that out. And see if they like it. And you don't even have to do it every day either. Just do it maybe 2 days a week. And just that contact with other people will make you feel better. Also, make sure you fly in remote employees and hold company-wide offsites together to make sure that everyone feels like they're a part of the team. And in general, so many people are thinking and writing about how to make remote work better. There's whole conferences about the subject now. So just look at what other people are doing, look into the research, just try new things and see if you can improve remote work at your company. So when I was planning this talk, I hadn't planned to discuss this, but several people asked me the question, so what about open plan offices? And that was interesting to me, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was probably kind of a leading question. I think people want me to come up here and give a very specific response. Which is to say that open plan offices are bad. So I'll make those people partly happy and say open plan offices are pretty bad, but I don't think that they're necessarily bad just because of mental health. I think if mental illness were completely not a thing, open plan offices would still have lots of problems. And that's what my research shows, but we'll go through it. On the positive side, they're more conducive to collaboration, creative problem solving between multiple employees. People get together, organically having discussions, thinking of things that they hadn't done before. I used to think that that was the reason why everyone did it, but it turns out that it's usually much more practical, like building fire code and things like that. They also can increase the sense of team unity and camaraderie, but I really want to emphasize the can here, because if there's already friction between employees, then it can actually cause resentment instead. But on the negative side, the #1 complaint about open plan offices is the noise, and particularly how it reduces productivity. So that affects everyone. From a mental health perspective, I think the biggest problem is the lack of privacy. Again, when I said for working from home, a big benefit is that it makes it easier to kind of duck out for a daytime therapy appointment. In an open plan office, you're going to have to walk out in front of everyone, and that makes some people very uncomfortable. It's also been cited for just generally increasing feelings of stress. And also some peer pressure. For mental health, this is bad for self-care because, for example, you might get to a point in your day when you realize that the best thing that you can do for yourself is just to take a 30-minute break from coding. Go outside, drink some water, do something other than staring at a computer screen. But if you're looking around and you see all your coworkers working hard, bent over their computers, chances are you're going to talk yourself out of taking that break. And so that's not good for your health. And then finally, they're also highly conducive to the spread of disease like the cold, the flu, etc. So again, I think the people who ask this question want me to come up here and say, well, we shouldn't have open plan offices anymore. But again, I'm trying to focus more on pragmatic solutions, and I think most of us don't have the power to completely change our office configuration. So focusing more on pragmatic solutions, I think the biggest one is to make sure you allow employees to work remotely, or if you already do, then maybe increase the number of days per week or per month when they can do so. Definitely urge your employees to work from home when sick. Don't have them bring that cold or flu into the office. Set aside small meeting spaces for quiet work. I feel like a lot of big companies in particular, almost everyone has that one conference room that's too small to have a productive meeting in. So maybe just say, we're not going to have meetings in that room anymore, and just set it aside for people to do quiet work if they need to. Also have the company provide noise-canceling headphones. And then finally, give every employee their own desk and encourage them to decorate their workspace. And that might sound silly, but there have actually been tons of studies done on this to back this up. There was a 2014 study done in Sweden where they tested different office configurations and tested how people responded to them. And the one that people responded to most poorly, especially men, was the open plan flex office, which is an open plan office where not everyone has their own desk. So everyone having their own workspace is actually very important to people's happiness and productivity. And there's a 2010 study done in the UK where they compared people who had decorated their workspace and people who had just left it completely bare when they moved in. And the people who had decorated their workspace were estimated to be 1/3 more productive. So these small life hacks work. Switching gears a little bit to on-call rotations. I thought about this one because this is the one that I think is pretty characteristic in my workplace. This is a pretty big deal. On the positive side, it's kind of a huge burden sometimes, but if it's shared among the team, that helps improve the sense of unity and camaraderie because everyone's doing their part. You know, no one has to be on call too often if everyone is part of the rotation. It also gives engineers a way to prove their understanding of the technical systems and their ability to manage a crisis. And so as a result, it's often part of the promotion criteria to become a senior software engineer, for example. But on the negative side, if you're living with a serious anxiety disorder, being on call means that you have to be prepared for something completely unexpected, which might be catastrophic for your company. And so that can be pretty triggering for your anxiety disorder and something very difficult to deal with. Also, if you do get called in the middle of the night, lack of sleep and interrupted sleep are very bad for mental health. They're obviously bad for physical health as well, but a lot of recent studies are starting to show that if you're already suffering from depression and anxiety disorders, poor sleep can actually worsen those over time. And then if you're being called constantly and having to constantly put out fires, that kind of high stress can lead to burnout pretty quickly. So the solutions for this, the good news is that the easiest one is something that I think all of us as developers can immediately do in our workplace, which is making sure that we fix these tech issues to make being on call less stressful. Actually prioritize it, make sure it ends up at the top of the backlog. Also, if someone is called in the middle of the night, give them adequate time to catch up on sleep. Make sure that there's a process in place for that so that they don't have to be at the office at 9 a.m. like everyone else. And then for employees with serious anxiety disorders, if it's at all possible, if there's enough people in the rotation already, maybe see if there's a way to take them out of that on-call rotation without making them feel like they're not contributing. And I really want to emphasize that last part because, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, one big reason for not speaking up is because people are afraid that it's going to take them out of promotion consideration. And being part of the on-call rotation often is one of the criteria for being promoted. So maybe see if there's some other project that they can do in your company to offset the fact that they're not able to be on call. Alcohol tech events. So this is another interesting one where I think there are certain people who would like to say we should just not have alcohol tech events anymore at all. And I'm not going to go that far, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But on the positive side, 1 or 2 drinks can make it easier for some introverts and those with social anxiety to socialize with their peers. And the next one is kind of a positive negative, but it's become expected in tech culture. So if you don't offer alcohol at your event, then the people who want to drink, because there's always going to be people who want to drink, will go find a bar instead of staying to mingle with other people at the event. And so this is the reason why a lot of tech conferences and meetups are unwilling to get rid of alcohol altogether. Because if those people leave, then the whole reason why we put up on this event in the first place isn't being realized if people aren't mingling and networking. But on the negative side, it makes non-drinkers feel unwelcome. And if you happen to be a recovering alcoholic, because alcoholism is considered a mental illness, this environment is going to be particularly threatening. And free alcohol and drinking culture are so pervasive that there are probably more functioning alcoholics in tech than we're even aware of. So again, focusing on pragmatic solutions, I don't want to go so far as to say no alcohol anymore ever, because too many conferences are just not comfortable with that. But some things that have been proven to work for other events are making sure that you offer nice alternatives, like the fancy sodas that come in the glass bottles, or even mocktails if possible. So that way non-drinkers, recovering alcoholics actually feel included. Also, always put a limit on the number of free drinks that you have. Use some kind of ticket or token system. A lot of conferences do this just for budgetary reasons because open bars are expensive, but it turns out to be good for health as well. Because the way it usually works is people will get like 2 drinks for free, and then maybe it turns into a cash bar after that. But chances are people will realize after 2 drinks that they already have like a nice buzz going. So if you then ask them to take out their wallet to pay for the 3rd drink, they might actually just think twice, and they might say, you know, actually, maybe I don't need that 3rd drink. And then they don't get drunk, and you don't have to deal with those kinds of issues. Another thing that works, and I wish more conferences and events would try it, but make sure you have activities other than drinking. There are some conferences that have like a board game night, and it's hugely successful because it turns out that there's a big overlap between developers and people who like playing board games. And if you have a recurring series of events, like a series of monthly meetups or a weekly company social, maybe just try alternating dry and non-dry events. So you don't have to cut out the alcohol completely, but just don't have it every single time. And then finally, add workplace wellness programs on substance abuse. I think we all have a tendency to roll our eyes at these, but it's still good to be periodically reminded that there are health consequences to drinking so much. So these are, in the end, still considered effective. And so that kind of brings me into management. My take on management is, I think being a good manager for the purposes of mental health is being a good manager, period. Which means things like not micromanaging, leaving the office on time, taking regular vacations, not sending or answering emails at 2 a.m. if at all possible, being receptive to feedback on your own performance in addition to giving people feedback on their performance, being a good listener, and finally, the only thing that's a little bit more specialized to this topic is being open to talking about your own health and mental health. And that might sound a little bit scary to be, that vulnerable to open up that much about your personal life. But your goal should be to make your employees feel comfortable saying, hey, look, I'm dealing with these issues and I'm going to need some kind of accommodation. And chances are they're not going to feel comfortable doing that unless you've opened up a little bit about yourself to them as well. So as scary as it sounds, it's worth it. Some other action items for managers: make sure your employees understand their health rights, especially in regard to things like medical leaves of absence for burnout and mental health issues. Revisit your hiring practices with an eye to mental illness and neurodiversity, and I'll talk more about neurodiversity in a minute. Make sure your employees feel valued and are on projects that they find fulfilling and empowering. And this might sound like it has nothing to do with mental health on the surface, but one thing that I have noticed in my time at OSMI, listening to people talk about their experiences with depression and anxiety, is that the times when they say that they feel like they're relapsing, they're starting to feel worse, that their medication is not helping them as much, are times when they also say that things at work have changed. They were put on a project that they don't understand the value of, management has stopped being transparent and not explaining their decisions, they're not being given chances to give feedback on what they're doing, etc. So making people feel like they're on projects that are worthwhile, that they have a chance to give feedback on, is actually hugely important for mental wellness as well. Get the OSMI handbooks. These are available on the OSMI website, but you can also go directly to LeanPub. There's 2 main ones. The first one talk about how to apply the ADA law to mental health, so that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that's a little bit more US focused and might not be as relevant if you're in the EU. But the other one just talks about how to start a mental wellness program in your workplace, and that's relevant to everyone, so definitely check that out. And then finally, consider offering mental health first aid. So mental health first aid is an international training course that was actually started in Australia, and it's available in the US, the Netherlands, and most other countries in the EU. Here in the Netherlands, it's offered in 4 sessions of 3 hours each that are usually spread out over 4 to 5 weeks. And the goal is to learn as basically first aid for someone who is experiencing some kind of mental health crisis. It's also much more expensive in the Netherlands than other places. It's about 275 euros per person, which does include materials. And so one way to offset those high costs is that as an employer, you can actually bring in a trainer to teach the course in your workplace. So then either you as the employer can pay for it, or at the very least, it's probably cheaper that way than to have everyone go to one of these other courses that are hosted somewhere else. But if you can't take the program because it's expensive, it's a little inaccessible, I'll give you a 2-minute crash course in what they teach. The bulk of what they focus on is this mnemonic called ALGEE, which is this 5-step program for helping someone in a crisis. And so the A stands for assess for a risk of suicide or harm. So basically figure out, is this person seriously at risk of killing themselves? And if it seems like they are, the recommendation is actually to call a suicide hotline because those are the people who are trained in that very specific area who can help out with that. But if they are not at serious risk of suicide or injury, then the next step is to listen non-judgmentally. And this is actually what the bulk of the course focuses on. They teach you all kinds of strategies for becoming a better listener. One example, a very interesting one that really stood out to me, is that they try to teach you not to say the words "I understand," especially if you're a mentally healthy person, because that might cause the person going through the crisis to shut down and not listen to you anymore because they're like, well, you can't possibly understand what I'm going through. So instead of saying "I understand," you might say something like "I hear you." And then that goes into give reassurance and information, remind them that they're not the only ones going through this. There are treatments available, there are ways to live a healthy, happy, productive life. And that goes into encouraging appropriate professional help. Obviously, the ideal next step is to get them in to see a therapist, but that might be difficult. Here in the Netherlands, there might be waiting lists. In the US, a big issue is insurance. So even if that's not possible, get them in to see their primary care physician. Here in Holland, the huisarts, because that can help. The primary care physician will definitely be able to help figure out what the appropriate next step is. And then finally, encourage self-help and other support strategies. So this is a big focus on self-care. They'll teach you some self-care techniques and figure out things like how to find a support group in your neighborhood. And so that brings me into the final section, the thornier stuff that we have to do together. The first one that I wanted to call out is supporting marginalized people in tech. Because chronic harassment, bullying, and microaggressions can lead to depression, exacerbate eating disorders, and cause or worsen other mental illnesses. And people tend to be surprised when I talk about eating disorders in a talk focused on tech. They're like, well, this is not Hollywood. We're not trying to be models here, so why would people have eating disorders? But it turns out that even in tech, women are still judged by their appearance. In Silicon Valley in particular, there have been reports of people hearing things like, oh, you only got this job because you're pretty. Or I'm so glad we hired you because all the other women that we interviewed for this position were really ugly. And if you're already struggling with past history of eating disorders or body image issues, then those kinds of microaggressions added up over time can make things much worse. And people from marginalized groups also often feel like they have to overperform because there's this whole myth that the bar was lowered to let them into the company. And that kind of thing can lead to increased stress and a greater likelihood of burnout. The second thing is to embrace neurodiversity, which I mentioned earlier. Neurodiversity is kind of a new term that has started to become more popular over the past 2 or 3 years, I think. And the idea here is that mental illnesses like ADHD and autism are the result of natural variations of the human genome. They say that people with these kinds of differences do not need to be cured. They need help and accommodation instead. Now, to be clear, the strongest proponents of neurodiversity are actually saying that we should completely stop looking for a cure for autism and just accept that autism is something that happens and it's here to stay. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with that. I'm not willing to go quite that far, but I'm also pragmatic enough to realize that even if we do find a cure for autism, it's probably too late for our generation. It might be in time for our children. But in the meantime, there's a whole generation of people who still want to lead healthy, happy, productive lives. And it's in our interest to support them as well, because some of our greatest inventions are attributed to people with atypical neurology. Ed Finkler himself has a quote that he likes to use in his talks that says, "Mental illness gives me superpowers." He talks about how his ADHD allows him to make connections between different things a lot faster than other people. And when they're honed in on one specific issue, he sees the entire system in a way that they don't. And in a similar way, there was an article in the Harvard Business Review from May entitled "Neurodiversity as a Competitive Advantage," that talked about similar things. They followed a couple of companies, like I think IBM and HP, that went out of their way to hire people on the autism spectrum to see how successful they would be in the company. And it turns out they were hugely successful. They were able to find bugs that no one had found. They came up with solutions that no one had thought of. But one thing that they discovered was actually the biggest barrier to getting people like this in the company was to get them through the interview process. And so there's a quote from the article that I want to read that I think is very powerful and really illustrates this very well, which is, "The behaviors of many neurodiverse people run counter to common notions of what makes a good employee. Solid communication skills, being a team player, emotional intelligence, persuasiveness, salesperson-type personalities, the ability to network, the ability to conform to standard practices without special accommodations, and so on. These criteria systematically screen out neurodiverse people." And so moving on, just kind of a general list of things we can only change as a culture. One big thing is this whole idea of all the best developers I know are always coding on the weekends and during holidays. Everyone needs to take breaks. This need to always be available by phone or email. I'm guilty of this as well. I go on vacation and I tell everyone in my office how to reach me if there's an emergency. The peer pressure caused by social media. A lot of recent studies are showing that Facebook, regular Facebook usage actually is very triggering for people with depression, because everyone only posts about the good things that happen in their lives. And so it makes it seem even more like everyone else is happy and I'm the only one who's sad. We talked about this already, but this belief that you must be in Silicon Valley to truly succeed as a software engineer. The stigma against talking about our feelings. And finally, this idea that engineers don't have empathy. And I didn't even realize this was a thing, maybe because I went to art school. But this was brought up in a tech conference talk that I attended a couple months ago, where this woman was saying that she was discouraged from using the word empathy in the office at all, because this consultant she had hired just said, engineers feel like they can't have empathy. They're taught very much like that's something only for people in the humanities. And that's ridiculous, because empathy is something that we all have the capacity for. We just have to choose to exercise it. And there was a quote that she used in that same talk, which I thought was very, very appropriate, which is, "Empathy is the antidote to shame." And she talked about this in the context of the shame and blame culture of tech, but I think it's very relevant to mental health as well, because the stigma associated with mental illness is essentially shame. And so empathy is the antidote. Which brings me back to my talk title, which is Empathy as a Service. And hopefully you've all picked up by now that it was intentionally ironic. There is no app for this. We can't deploy it to the cloud. We can't automate it away. It's something that all of us have to choose to exercise for our peers to make our profession better. And if you're struggling with how to do that, if you're mentally healthy like myself, then I encourage you to think about this quote that Ed gives that I think is really helpful, which is, "I could do so many awesome things if only my own head didn't get in the way." And so I have a list of resources, but I'm basically out of time, so I'm not going to go through all of these, but they're in my slides. And if you have questions about what any of these are for, feel free to come ask me afterwards, and I'll be happy to explain. So I don't want to keep you all from lunch, so if you have questions or things that you want to talk about, either come find me now, or you can send me an email or find me on Twitter. I also have OSMI stickers, and I really don't want to take these back to the US, so if you're part of like a local user group or something like that, then please take the rest of my stickers. That's all I had.